So I'd like to welcome everyone to another video. This one's going to be on research question tips with me, Dr. Bill Mallon. So I'm trying out a new format here. I'm going to be in a little box, living my best life and just guiding you through some tips and tricks which I've picked up, which I think is really going to help you maximize your research question and really help you gain the best marks in your master's or PhD or undergrad thesis. So let's have a look here and let's get started, okay? So there I am again in another box, or a circle this time, and I'm going to talk about tip number 1, okay? Be clear and be concise. So what does that mean? So ensure that your research question is well defined and specific. It should be clear to both you and your readers what you're trying to investigate, okay? So here's a good example. What are the effects of mindfulness meditation on reducing symptoms of anxiety in college students? Now, if we're talking about how you can be clear and how you can be concise in a research question like this, well, here we go, okay? So the question is specific in terms of the intervention, which is mindfulness meditation, the target population, which is college students, and then the outcome itself, which is reducing symptoms of anxiety. So when I see a question like this, I think, okay, that's very clear, that's very concise, because it's hit these 3 things: intervention, target population, and outcome. So when you're looking at your own research question, just make sure that it has the intervention part, the target population, and the outcome. So that's very important for this one, okay? And there I am again. Tip number 2, ensure relevance and significance. Now, what does that mean? Your research question should address a gap in the existing literature and contribute to the field. And here's a good example of that. So how does the implementation of renewable energy policies impact economic growth in developing countries? Okay, so how is that relevant and significant? Well, the question addresses an important issue, which is renewable energy and economic development. So that's always going to be relevant. And it aims to fill a gap in understanding the specific relationship between policy implementation and economic growth in developing countries. So there's a very clear example of relevance and significance. So whenever your supervisor is like, make sure your research question is relevant and significant, just go to this slide and say, okay, well, here's a good example of that. How do I make my research question more in line with that? Tip number 3, be open to revision. This is a very important one, okay? So remain flexible and open to refining or revising your research question as you delve deeper into the literature and conduct preliminary research. It's a long-winded way of saying that things change. My own research question, I'm sure your own research question, from proposal to the beginning of your thesis, halfway through your thesis, even the end of your thesis, things change. You have to reevaluate things. You might say, you know what, this particular topic needs to be a bit more narrow. So I need to subtly change the research question. So always be open to revision, okay? Here's an example of that. So initially your research question might be, what factors influence consumer purchasing decisions? It's quite a broad question, quite a tricky question. So let's refine it further. After reviewing literature and conducting initial research, you may refine it to focus on a specific aspect. So how does brand loyalty influence consumer purchasing decisions in the smartphone industry? So now we've gone super specific, smartphone industry. And so instead of just saying what factors influence consumer purchasing decisions, we've refined it further. So we're talking about brand loyalty. So that's a sort of more specific thing. And the smartphone industry. So now we have a target population. And all that really does is basically say, okay, your supervisor might say to you, this is way too broad. And a lot of supervisors might let you continue on with that line of thought. But eventually, when it comes to, especially if you're doing primary research, your thesis is going to be like 700,000 words. That is way too broad a topic. So if we just refine it down to a specific issue, brand loyalty, and a specific industry, which is the smartphone industry, now we're cooking. Now we have a little bit more leeway to work. We don't have to read as much books. Tip number 4, consider the research design, okay? And we can see here in this lovely thought bubble, I've put a lot of, or speech bubble, I put a lot of thought into. We can see that ensure that your research question aligns with an appropriate research design whether it's qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, okay? Research question will determine the choice of research methods. And our good friend here, Saran Takos, 2013, suggests there are 4 issues to keep in mind when choosing a research question: relevance, researchability, feasibility, and ethics, okay? And as always, an example is key. What are the experiences of LGBTQ individuals in accessing mental health services in rural areas? So we're looking at this question, we're saying, okay, how am I going to answer this question? So what are the resources I need? So this question suggests a qualitative approach. So interviews are focus groups, because you're going to be looking at the lived experience of these individuals in this specific location, and you're looking at a specific context, which is accessing mental health services. So if I'm looking at this question, the main thing is the word experiences, because if you do a quantitative type analysis where you just do a survey and you get facts and figures, is that going to get the experience of people? Probably not. You can do a Likert style question or a questionnaire where you get gradients of how people are feeling, but you don't actually get into the heart of the matter. So if I see the word experiences, more often than not, I'm doing a qualitative interview or focus group type design. Now, tip number 5, consider the practical applications. So consider the practical applications. So think about the practical applications of your research design and how its findings could be applied in real-world contexts. And here's a good example of that. What are the key factors influencing employee retention in the tech industry, and how can companies improve retention rates? So let's have a look at that there. This question not only identifies a problem, high turnover in the tech industry, but also seeks actionable insights that organizations can use to address this issue, okay? I'm aware there should be a comma there on here. Don't hate. No haters. Tip number 6, ensure ethical considerations. Now, consider the ethical implications of your research question, particularly if it involves human participants or sensitive topics. We might return back to the earlier question on LGBTQ individuals, and we might need to get some consent forms, some confidentiality agreements in place. We have to ensure that our line of questioning does not bring up undue trauma or triggers people. So all these sort of things you have to consider when you're doing your research question. Here's an example. What are the psychological effects of long-term solitary confinement on incarcerated individuals? It's obviously going to be a very sensitive topic. So it raises ethical concerns regarding participant well-being and confidentiality, requiring careful consideration of ethical guidelines and informed consent procedures. So always keep the ethical in mind when you're doing your research question. Tip number 7. Consider the motive. So what does that mean? So when you consider the motive, you consider the wording also. So let's have a look at some directive words, okay? So as promised, I'm going to have a look at these different directive words, and I'm going to give everyone a breakdown of the most common ones you would see. So let me just get the old laser pointer here. So the purpose of this is just to basically show you that even though there's a lot of different terms you might see on a research paper in terms of research question, or even like an essay where someone says, okay, I want you to comment on or compare and contrast. All these tables there that I'm going to show you is there's a lot of overlap between them all. So don't worry if you're kind of saying to yourself, you know what, this one here, I'm not quite sure, like criticize and critically evaluate. What's the difference between the two? Often there isn't. Often it's just a case of just mixing things up. So even if we see here like comment on, so identify and write about the main issues, give your reactions based on what you've read, heard in lectures, avoid just personal opinion. Now that goes for everything. So always avoid your personal opinion. You know, not that no one cares. It's just that you just have to be very careful, because you have to have some sort of an academic tone, academic flavor to your work. So anything that has personal opinion, you then stray into I don't know what the term for it would be, but I suppose personal opinion is the best term for it. Compare, look for the similarities between two things, so two studies. You're going to bring into the light there Sorry, well, I don't know what I'm talking about there. Sorry. You're basically anything to do with compare. It's to do with intertextuality. So you're basically comparing one study to another, or comparing multiple studies. You're either showing similarities or how one differs from the other. And then you're showing the relevance or consequences of these similarities, concluding which is preferable. Contrast is more or less the same, you're just showing the differences. Whenever someone says criticize, obviously if you're a budding undergrad just starting off, criticize is not used in the usual sense of disparage or like using any sort of derogatory language to bring down. You're basically pointing out mistakes and weaknesses, but from a detached, unpersonal point of view. But you're also indicating any favorable aspects of the subject of the question. So it requires, as it says here, a balanced answer, a balanced approach. Critically evaluate, so that means you're weighing arguments for and against something. You're assessing the strengths of the evidence on both sides. Now that does not mean that you're both sides in the argument, nor does it mean you're sitting on the fence. You're just merely providing this person said that and the other person said that, and you're letting the data speak for itself. And you're using criteria to guide your assessment of which opinions, theories, models, or items are preferable. Now, to do this, you're going to bring into the light. I can't think of the term. I'm just going to keep using that lovely metaphor of bringing into the light, because words have somehow escaped me at the moment. But you're going to bring into the light the idea of evaluating sources. Why use one source over another? Why use one theory over another? Maybe it's a very important study that has endured for decades. It's a go-to study, or it's been peer reviewed. Whenever you see something that says define, you're basically giving the exact meaning of, and where relevant, show your understanding of how the definition may be problematic. Anything to do with describe, give the exact meaning of, where relevant, show you how you understand the definition may be problematic. So describe in many ways is different from descriptive writing. So just be very careful when you see something that says describe. It doesn't mean that you indulge descriptive writing. Everything should be academic writing in relation to this. And I'll get to that in another video of the difference between descriptive and academic writing. But for now, just give the exact meaning of it and then show how you understand this definition can be problematic. So look, we're getting to the end of the table here. So discuss, investigates or examines by arguments, sift and debate, give reasons for and against, examine the implication. You see a lot of overlap here. There's a lot of and this is where a lot of students sort of get a bit worried. They're kind of saying like, well, what is the difference between one and the other? The differences are very nuanced, and sometimes they're very slight. I would say the best go-to approach for any of these is this one, to critically evaluate, because this one's going to do a lot of heavy lifting for the other ones. Because to critically evaluate something, it means you're evaluating the source, you're given a balanced view, you're given both sides of the arguments, you're shown why one is better than the other, the limitations of it. So this one sort of encompasses everything. So even if you are asked to contrast or compare or comment on or criticize or describe or discuss, it all boils down to you critically evaluating. You're adopting not a cold or a clinical one, but like a detached view. You're saying this is what everyone is saying. Here's the sources for it. It's been peer reviewed. It's been in the sort of the academic pool for X amount of years, and it's held its water. So we should keep using it. So that's like, even when we go into the next slide here of other terms. I'd still say to you to keep in mind that critically evaluate, critically analyze, or even criticize. They're all basically linking into one another. So like stuff here like examine, explain, explore, illustrate, justify, outline, state, summarize, and anything to say that, or anything that uses that term to what extent. You're still engaging in critical engagement and critical analysis. So don't be worried about these terms. If you see something like, an examiner says, or even a supervisor says, you haven't examined stuff enough, or you haven't illustrated something enough, or where's your justification for that? All they're really saying is, I need to see more critical engagement. I need to see more academic rigor in your approach. And even that term rigor, like all it's really saying is, indulge in academic writing and critically analyze. Don't just describe what's happening. Go a little bit further, show me some contrasting studies, show me some similar studies. So I would say, just for the moment, just in terms of this slideshow, all these terms more or less just mean critically analyze. And anything to do with intertextuality, evaluating sources, critical engagement, different types of critical thinking terms, I'm going to cover them in other videos, and I'm going to post links to them down below when they come out. So don't be worried too much about that for the moment, okay? Now, we're back to tip number 8. Know your limits. So what does this mean? Well, we touched upon it earlier on, where I was talking about refining and revising your research question. So finding the limits of your research question in a thesis involves defining the scope and boundaries of your study to ensure that it remains focused, manageable, and relevant. So you do this by conducting a thorough review of existing literature related to your topic. You identify key concepts, theories, and findings that are relevant to your research question. This will help you understand the existing knowledge in the field and identify gaps or areas where further research is needed. Also, consider the time and space. So determine the time period and geographic scope of your study. We'll be focusing on a specific time period, location, population, or context. Clarifying these parameters will help you narrow down the scope of your research question. This brings up issues regarding inclusion and exclusion criteria. And what I mean by that is, do you just need English language texts? Is there a specific time period? Maybe 2000 to 2020 is perfectly sufficient. What's the age group? All these sort of things come under the heading of inclusion and exclusion criteria. Another thing when you're trying to refine and limit the research question is to clarify the objectives and hypotheses. So clearly articulate the objectives and hypotheses of your study to align with the boundaries of your research question. This will help guide your research design and data analysis strategies. Nearly there, folks. Tip number 9, be careful with the wording. Here's my research question, but the sentence is not in the form of a question. Very, very common mistake. People will say, the following research question is put forward, and then they put the research question there, but there's no question mark, and it's written in the form of to investigate. It might sound really petty, it might sound really silly, but start off on the right foot, okay? If you're presenting to me a research question, it should have a question mark in it. So don't confuse it with your objectives. Objectives will generally be in the style of to investigate or to evaluate. Another important one, don't confuse your research question with your interview questions. So interview questions is what you go to your interview with, strangely enough. Your research question is what you have before you write your interview questions. So your research question and your objectives, that's going to guide what type of interview questions you need. So if you keep mentioning your thesis that you asked participants research questions, you shouldn't be asking them any research questions, you should be asking them interview questions. So as I said here, your research question / questions and objectives should inform your interview questions. Now, we can have a discussion here about how many research questions you should have. One is, in my opinion, perfectly fine. One research question and then maybe 3 or 4 objectives guiding the question. And in all the theses I've corrected over the last 10 years, the ones that always make it through without any hassle or issue just has one research question and then 3 or 4 objectives guiding the question. If you get into the whole process of like, well, I've actually 3 research questions, you and your supervisor are having a chat and they say, do 3 research questions. And then you do 3 research questions and then you've got like what, 3 or 4 objectives for each of them? That's ridiculous. One research question, 3 or 4 objectives, okay? It just works, okay? That's what I've seen working all the time. So the ones that have 3 research questions, the findings are arranged individually to each of the research question. It's just a mess, and usually at your Viva, the mess will be brought up. So don't do that, okay? Tip number 10. Return to the research question. This is a very important one that people always forget about. As I say here, one of the most common errors I see in someone's thesis about master's and PhD level is the absence of any mention of the research question and objectives in the conclusion. People just forget about it. They bring it up in the introduction and say, okay, here's my research question, here's my objectives. This is the whole thrust of my thesis, the whole point of me doing my thesis. And then we get to conclusion and it's never mentioned again. So The poor examiner is like, well, they must have been not important to them if they never brought it up again. Very simple. Just whenever you have your conclusion chapter, the opening, this summary of your thesis should include the research question. It should form a bookend with your introduction chapter. This thesis set out to answer the following research question, give the research question. It has done so through the following objectives. Give the objectives. And then talk about how your findings and your discussion has helped you answer that research question. And just something, even aesthetically, it looks like, okay, here's the beginning, here's the end. And there's a return, it forms a parallel with it. So that's very important. Typically, the first section of the conclusion chapter will be a summary of what has happened in your findings and discussion chapter. You will then mention how that has satisfied the requirements of the research question and objectives. Just remember, the most important thing with the research question is make sure that it's always returned to. Because always keep your research question in mind. You can actually bring up your research question in the methodology chapter as well. And that's going to be very, very helpful for your examiner or your supervisor when they go to correct your thesis, that they say, okay, this student realizes that the research question is important and it must be threaded through. So just remember, there's 10 tips in this slideshow. Follow them and you really can't go wrong.